While researching a routine story about local newspaper circulation decline in the basement archives of the Springfield Tribune, veteran journalist Rachel Martinez stumbled upon a decades-old missing person file that had been incorrectly cataloged with the business records. But when she opened the yellowed folder and saw the faded photograph of 12-year-old Tommy Brennan, who vanished without a trace during his morning paper route on October 15, 1989, she noticed something in the background of one particular newspaper clipping that made her hands tremble and her heart race, because this seemingly insignificant detail would unravel a 35-year-old mystery that had haunted an entire community and reveal a truth so shocking that it would destroy reputations, end careers, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous predators hide in plain sight while an entire town searches desperately in all the wrong places. Before we dive into this incredible investigation that spans decades and uncovers corruption at the highest levels, let us know where you're watching from today. And if stories of justice finally being served inspire you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The musty scent of old paper and deteriorating cardboard boxes filled Rachel's nostrils as she descended into the basement of the Springfield Tribune building on that crisp Tuesday morning in November 2024. She had been working as an investigative journalist for nearly 20 years, having started her career right here at this small-town newspaper before moving on to larger publications in Chicago and New York, only to return to Springfield 3 years ago when her aging mother needed care, and the Tribune offered her a senior position that would allow her the flexibility to work from home when necessary. The basement archives had always been a treasure trove of forgotten stories, a place where the history of Springfield lay buried beneath layers of dust and neglect, waiting for someone with patience and curiosity to uncover its secrets. Rachel's assignment that morning was straightforward and, frankly, rather mundane. The Tribune's circulation had been steadily declining for the past decade, mirroring the struggles of local newspapers across the country, and her editor wanted her to write a retrospective piece about the golden age of newspaper delivery in Springfield. The story would focus on how the town's paper routes had once been a rite of passage for local children, providing them with their first taste of responsibility and earning power, before gradually giving way to adult carriers and eventually to the current system of contracted delivery services that employed mostly elderly residents and college students looking for extra income. She had been methodically working through boxes, labeled Circulation Records 1985-1995, for nearly 2 hours when she encountered a filing mishap that would change everything. Wedged between invoices for newspaper printing and delivery truck maintenance records was a manila folder that clearly didn't belong with the business documents. The folder was thick, bulging with what appeared to be newspaper clippings, police reports, and correspondence, all held together by a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity and crumbled at her touch. The label on the folder, written in faded blue ink in someone's careful handwriting, read simply, Tommy Brennan, Missing Child Case, 1989. Rachel's eyebrows rose with interest. As a journalist, she was naturally drawn to unsolved mysteries, and she vaguely remembered hearing whispered references to a missing child from decades past, though the details had always been sketchy, and the adults in her childhood had seemed reluctant to discuss the matter in front of children. She opened the folder carefully, mindful of the age and fragility of the documents inside. The first item that greeted her was an X10 black and white photograph of a smiling boy with tousled brown hair, gap-toothed grin, and bright eyes that seemed to sparkle with mischief and intelligence. Below the photograph, typed on what appeared to be police department letterhead, were the basic facts. Tommy Brennan, age 12, disappeared October 15, 1989. Last seen beginning his paper route at approximately 6:30 a.m. on Maple Street. Rachel found herself studying the boy's face, imagining what he might have looked like as a grown man if he had lived to see his 47th birthday this year. There was something universally appealing about Tommy's expression, the kind of open, trusting face that would have made him popular with adults and peers alike. She could easily picture him riding his bicycle through the quiet streets of Springfield in the early morning hours, tossing newspapers onto front porches with the practiced accuracy that came from months of repetition. The next document in the folder was a timeline of events compiled by the Springfield Police Department. According to the official record, Tommy had left his house at 6:15 a.m. on that October morning, just as he had done every day for the past 8 months since taking over the route from an older boy who had moved away. His mother, Patricia Brennan, had watched him load his canvas newspaper bag and mount his red Schwinn bicycle, calling out her usual reminder to be careful at the intersection of Maple and Oak Streets, where visibility was limited by an overgrown hedge. Tommy's route consisted of 47 houses scattered across 6 residential streets in the Riverside neighborhood, a middle-class area of modest 2-story homes built primarily in the 1950s and 1960s. The route typically took him between 45 minutes and an hour to complete, depending on weather conditions and whether he stopped to chat with any of the early rising residents who sometimes came out to collect their papers personally. On this particular morning, the weather had been clear and mild for mid-October, with temperatures in the low 60s and no wind to speak of. The timeline showed that Tommy had successfully delivered newspapers to the first 19 houses on his route, following his usual pattern of starting on Maple Street and working his way through the neighborhood in a logical sequence that minimized backtracking and unnecessary mileage. Several residents had reported seeing him that morning, including Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher at 1247 Maple Street, who noted that Tommy had waved to her as she watered her front garden around 6:45 a.m., and Mr. Harold Thompson at 1312 Oak Street, who had been leaving for his job at the lumber mill and had exchanged a few words with Tommy about the previous night's high school football game around 7 a.m. The last confirmed sighting of Tommy Brennan came from Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, who lived at 1456 Pine Street and had been letting her cat out for its morning prowl when she saw Tommy approaching on his bicycle around 7:15 a.m. She reported that he had seemed his usual cheerful self, whistling as he pedaled, and had given her a friendly wave before turning the corner onto Birch Street, where the next cluster of houses on his route were located. After that, Tommy Brennan simply vanished. When he failed to return home by 8:30 a.m., his mother initially assumed he had stopped to help someone with yard work or had gotten into a lengthy conversation with one of his regular customers, several of whom were elderly residents who enjoyed chatting with the polite, articulate boy. Tommy was known for his kindness and willingness to help, often carrying groceries or newspapers to the front door for customers who had difficulty walking, and his mother had specifically instructed him never to be rude to adults, even if it meant running a few minutes late. By 9 a.m., however, Patricia Brennan's maternal instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Tommy was a responsible child who understood the importance of punctuality, especially when it came to his paper route, which he took seriously as his first real job. He also knew that he needed to be home in time to get ready for school, and he had never been late for his morning routine without calling to explain. Patricia began making phone calls, first to several customers along Tommy's route, then to his school to see if he had perhaps gone directly there for some reason. When these inquiries yielded no information about her son's whereabouts, she called the Springfield Police Department at 9:47 a.m. to report Tommy missing. The initial police response was somewhat lackluster, reflecting the common assumption that missing children, particularly older children like Tommy, were usually runaways who would return home within a day or two once they got hungry or scared. The duty officer who took Patricia's call was Detective Ray Sullivan, a 20-year veteran of the force who had handled dozens of missing child reports over the years and had developed a somewhat cynical attitude about parental panic. Detective Sullivan's initial report, a copy of which was included in the folder, noted that Tommy had no history of behavioral problems, had never run away before, and had no known conflicts with family members or peers that might motivate him to leave home voluntarily. However, Sullivan also noted that Tommy was approaching adolescence, an age when children sometimes acted impulsively, and that the boy might have simply decided to skip school and explore the woods behind the residential area. losing track of time in the process. The detective's recommendation was to wait 24 hours before launching a full-scale search, operating under the theory that Tommy would likely return on his own once he realized the trouble he was in. This decision would later prove to be one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case, with critics arguing that the crucial first hours after a child's disappearance were wasted due to police complacency and outdated assumptions about missing children. Patricia Brennan, however, was not willing to wait for official action. She spent the remainder of that first day organizing her own search effort, enlisting the help of neighbors, fellow church members, and other parents from Tommy's school. By late afternoon, nearly 50 volunteers were combing through the Riverside neighborhood, calling Tommy's name and checking every possible hiding place they could think of. The volunteer searchers found Tommy's bicycle first. It was discovered around 4:30 p.m. by a group of high school students searching along Birch Street, abandoned in a small patch of woods about 200 yards from the last house on Tommy's route. The red Schwinn was lying on its side beneath a cluster of oak trees, still loaded with undelivered newspapers that had scattered slightly when the bike fell, but remained largely intact in the canvas delivery bag. The discovery of the bicycle transformed the case from a possible runaway situation into something far more sinister. There was no logical reason for Tommy to have abandoned his bike in the woods, especially with undelivered newspapers still in his bag. The boy was known to be responsible and conscientious about his job, and even if he had decided to explore the wooded area for some reason, he would have secured his bicycle and newspapers first. Detective Sullivan arrived at the scene within 30 minutes of the bicycle's discovery, and his attitude toward the case underwent an immediate and dramatic shift. The woods where the bike was found were dense and difficult to navigate, particularly for someone on foot, and there were no clear paths or trails that would have attracted a child's curiosity. More troubling still, the bicycle appeared to have been placed in its location rather than crashed or dropped accidentally, suggesting that someone had deliberately hidden it among the trees. A more thorough search of the immediate area revealed additional evidence that turned the case from a missing child report into a potential abduction investigation. About 50 feet from where the bicycle was found, searchers discovered several pieces of torn newspaper that appeared to have been ripped from one of Tommy's undelivered papers. The newspaper fragments were scattered in a rough line leading deeper into the woods, as if someone had been dropping them intentionally to mark a trail. Following this paper trail led searchers to a small clearing approximately a quarter mile into the woods, where they made a discovery that sent chills through everyone present. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones that appeared to have been arranged deliberately, with what looked like the remains of a small campfire. In the center, around the stone circle, investigators found additional evidence of human activity: several cigarette butts, an empty beer bottle, and most disturbing of all, a child's baseball cap that Tommy's mother later identified as belonging to her son. The baseball cap was found hanging from a low branch of a maple tree at the edge of the clearing, positioned at eye level as if it had been placed there intentionally. The cap showed no signs of damage or struggle, but its placement seemed deliberate and ominous, particularly given the ritualistic arrangement of the stone circle and fire pit. As darkness fell on October 15, 1989, the Springfield Police Department officially classified Tommy Brennan's disappearance as a suspected abduction, and Detective Sullivan called in additional resources from the county sheriff's department and state police. The small clearing in the woods was cordoned off as a crime scene, and plans were made for an extensive search of the surrounding forest area beginning at first light the following morning. Rachel found herself completely absorbed in the case file, her original assignment forgotten as she read through page after page of police reports, witness statements, and newspaper clippings documenting the massive search effort that had consumed Springfield for the next several weeks. The story that emerged from these documents was one of a community united in determination to find one of their own, but also increasingly frustrated and frightened as days turned to weeks with no sign of Tommy Brennan. The search for Tommy had been exhaustive and unprecedented in the history of Springfield, Within 48 hours of his disappearance, nearly 500 volunteers had joined the effort, including police officers and firefighters from neighboring communities, members of the National Guard, search and rescue teams with specially trained dogs, and even a helicopter unit borrowed from the state police. Every inch of the woods behind the Riverside neighborhood was systematically searched, along with abandoned buildings, construction sites, drainage culverts, and any other location where a child might be hidden or have sought shelter. The search expanded to include the banks of Silver Creek, which ran through the woods about a mile from where Tommy's bicycle was found, and divers were brought in to search the deeper pools and beaver ponds that dotted the waterway. Despite this massive effort, no additional evidence of Tommy's fate was ever discovered. The stone circle and fire pit in the clearing were thoroughly investigated, but forensic analysis revealed no useful fingerprints, DNA evidence, or other clues about who might have used the site or when. The cigarette butts and beer bottle were tested but yielded no matches to any known suspects, and interviews with local residents failed to identify anyone who had seen suspicious activity in the woods prior to Tommy's disappearance. As Rachel continued reading through the case file, she was struck by the thoroughness of the investigation and the dedication of everyone involved. Detective Sullivan, despite his initial skepticism, had thrown himself into the case with remarkable intensity, working 18-hour days and following up on even the most unlikely leads and theories. The case file contained hundreds of pages of interview notes, evidence logs, and investigative reports that painted a picture of a police department and community that had left no stone unturned in their search for answers. Yet for all their efforts, Tommy Brennan remained missing, and as weeks turned to months, the case gradually faded from the front pages of the Springfield Tribune and the daily conversations of local residents. The official investigation remained open, but with no new leads or evidence, there was little for investigators to pursue. Tommy's case joined the ranks of thousands of other missing children across the country, a tragedy that haunted those who remembered it, but gradually slipped from the collective consciousness of the community. It was at this point in her reading that Rachel encountered the detail that would change everything she thought she knew about the case. Rachel Martinez had always been drawn to stories that others preferred to forget. At 43 years old, she possessed the kind of restless curiosity that had made her both an excellent investigative journalist and a somewhat difficult daughter. Always pushing boundaries and asking uncomfortable questions that her more conventional family members would have preferred she leave alone. Her return to Springfield 3 years earlier had been motivated primarily by her mother's declining health, but she had found unexpected satisfaction in covering local stories for the Tribune, rediscovering the tight-knit community dynamics that big city journalism often lacked. Her apartment on Cherry Street, just 6 blocks from the Tribune offices, reflected her methodical approach to both life and work. The living room served as an extension of her office, with filing cabinets lining one wall and a large corkboard covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes that tracked her various ongoing investigations. Rachel's neighbors had grown accustomed to seeing lights burning in her windows until well past midnight, and her landlord had long since stopped commenting on the boxes of documents that regularly arrived by mail or courier. The morning, she discovered, Tommy Brennan's case file had started like any other weekday in her carefully structured routine. Rachel woke at 5:30 a.m., brewed a pot of strong coffee, and spent the first hour of her day reading national news online while making notes for potential local angles on national stories. Her editor at the Tribune, Jim Kowalski, appreciated her ability to find connections between major news events and Springfield residents, and she had built a reputation for stories that made readers feel connected to the larger world beyond their small town. At 7 a.m. sharp, Rachel had walked the 8 blocks to her mother's house on Elm Street, a ritual she had maintained since moving back to Springfield. Elena Martinez, now 78 and suffering from early-stage dementia, still lived independently but needed daily check-ins to ensure she was taking her medications, eating properly, and hadn't forgotten to turn off appliances or lock doors. These morning visits had become precious to Rachel, offering a chance to connect with her mother during the hours when Elena's mind was typically clearest and most present. Elena had been a high school English teacher for 37 years before retiring. And even now, her apartment was filled with books, newspapers, and magazines that she collected obsessively, though she rarely read them anymore. Rachel had learned to navigate around the towering stacks of printed material, understanding that her mother's hoarding of reading material was her way of clinging to the intellectual life that had defined her identity for so many decades. During that particular morning's visit, Elena had been unusually talkative, sharing memories from her teaching years and asking detailed questions about Rachel's current assignments. It was during this conversation that Rachel first mentioned her circulation decline story, explaining how she would be spending the day in the Tribune's archives researching the history of newspaper delivery in Springfield. Elena's reaction had been immediate and unexpected. Her eyes had sharpened with sudden focus, and she had gripped Rachel's hand with surprising strength. "Be careful in that basement, mija," she had said, using the Spanish endearment she typically reserved for moments of particular concern. "There are stories down there that some people worked very hard to bury. Stories about children who asked too many questions." At the time, Rachel had assumed her mother was having one of her increasingly frequent episodes where past and present became confused in her memory. Elena sometimes spoke about her former students as if they were still children, worrying about homework assignments from decades past, or fretting about playground conflicts that had been resolved before Rachel was even born. But something about the intensity in her mother's voice had stayed with Rachel throughout the morning, creating an undercurrent of unease that she couldn't quite shake. After leaving her mother's house, Rachel had stopped at Sunrise Diner for breakfast, a habit she had developed as a way of staying connected to the pulse of Springfield's daily life. The diner served as an unofficial town hall, where local residents gathered to discuss everything from weather and sports to politics and gossip. And Rachel had found it invaluable for picking up leads on potential stories and gauging community sentiment on various issues. Martha Henley, the diner's owner and head waitress for the past 22 years, had noticed Rachel's preoccupied expression and commented on it while pouring her coffee. "You look like you're already working on something complicated, and it's not even 8 in the morning," Martha had observed with the kind of familiarity that came from serving the same customers day after day. Rachel had mentioned her archive assignment, and Martha's expression had grown thoughtful. "You know, there was a time when being a paperboy in this town was almost dangerous," Martha had said, lowering her voice slightly. "Back in the late 80s, early 90s, parents stopped letting their kids take those routes for a while. Something about a boy who went missing, though people don't like to talk about it much anymore." The comment had stuck with Rachel throughout breakfast, adding another layer to the vague unease she had been feeling since her conversation with her mother. Springfield was the kind of town where major events became part of the collective memory, passed down through generations of residents who took pride in knowing their community's history. For a story as significant as a missing child to have faded from common knowledge suggested either that it had been deliberately suppressed or that the trauma had been so intense that residents had collectively chosen to forget. By the time Rachel arrived at the Tribune offices at 9 a.m., she was already more intrigued by the potential stories hidden in the archives than by her assigned piece about circulation decline. The Tribune building itself was a testament to the golden age of local journalism, a 3-story brick structure built in 1924 that had housed the newspaper's operations for a century. The ground floor contained the current newsroom, advertising department, and printing facilities, while the second floor housed the publisher's offices and conference rooms that were rarely used anymore. The basement, where Rachel was headed, had originally been designed as storage space for printing supplies and bound copies of old editions. But over the decades, it had evolved into a repository for everything the newspaper couldn't bear to throw away, but had no immediate use for. File cabinets lined the walls, filled with decades of correspondence, story files, and business records that told the complete history of both the Tribune and Springfield itself. Jim Kowalski had given Rachel carte blanche to spend as much time as needed in the archives, understanding that her circulation story would benefit from historical context and specific anecdotes about the newspaper delivery business. He had also mentioned that the basement probably needed a thorough cleaning and organization, suggesting that Rachel might identify materials that could be digitized for the Tribune's website or donated to the Springfield Historical Society. Rachel had approached the archive project with the same systematic methodology she applied to all her investigations. She began by surveying the entire basement space, noting the general organization system and identifying the file cabinets and storage boxes that were most likely to contain relevant information. The circulation records she needed were concentrated in one corner of the basement, organized by decade and clearly labeled, making them relatively easy to locate and access. She had been working steadily for nearly 2 hours, taking notes and occasionally photographing particularly interesting documents with her phone when she encountered the misfiled folder that would change the trajectory of her entire investigation. The Tommy Brennan case file had been wedged between routine business documents in a way that suggested it had been placed there deliberately rather than misfiled accidentally, though Rachel didn't immediately recognize the significance of this detail. As she read through the case documents, Rachel found herself increasingly absorbed not just by the tragic story of Tommy's disappearance, but by the quality and thoroughness of the investigation that had followed. Detective Ray Sullivan's reports were meticulous and detailed, revealing a law enforcement professional who had clearly been deeply committed to finding answers. The witness statements were comprehensive, the search efforts had been exhaustive, and the evidence collection had followed proper procedures throughout. What struck Rachel as particularly noteworthy was the level of community involvement in the search for Tommy. The case file contained dozens of letters from concerned citizens offering assistance, volunteer schedules for search teams, and detailed logs of tips and potential leads that had been called into the police department. Springfield residents had clearly rallied around the Brennan family with remarkable unity and determination, contributing both time and resources to the search effort. The newspaper coverage of the case, represented by clippings from the Tribune and several regional papers, had been extensive and sympathetic. Front-page stories had run for weeks, keeping Tommy's disappearance in the public eye and maintaining pressure on law enforcement to continue their investigation. Editorial pieces had praised the community's response, while also questioning whether enough resources were being devoted to finding missing children in general. Reading through these clippings, Rachel was struck by the quality of the journalism and the obvious commitment of her predecessors at the Tribune to covering the story thoroughly and responsibly. The reporters had managed to keep the public informed without sensationalizing the tragedy or compromising the police investigation, a balance that required considerable skill and professionalism. As she continued reading, Rachel began to notice subtle patterns in the coverage that suggested the case had remained active for much longer than she had initially realized. Even months after Tommy's disappearance, the Tribune continued to run follow-up stories about new leads being investigated, search areas being expanded, and rewards being offered for information. The case had clearly maintained its hold on the community's attention for an extended period, which made its current obscurity even more puzzling. It was while reading through the later newspaper clippings that Rachel first encountered references to potential suspects and persons of interest who had been questioned during the investigation. The reporting was careful and legally cautious, using phrases like sources close to the investigation and according to unofficial reports, but it was clear that police had identified several individuals whose behavior or backgrounds had warranted closer scrutiny. One name that appeared repeatedly in these later stories was that of Marcus Webb, a drifter who had been arrested for vagrancy in Springfield just 2 weeks before Tommy's disappearance. Webb had been questioned extensively about his whereabouts on the morning of October 15th, and while he had been released due to lack of evidence, several sources suggested that he remained a person of interest throughout the investigation. Another, Individual mentioned in the coverage was David Carlson, a local man in his 30s who had been known to frequent the woods behind the Riverside neighborhood and had been questioned after several residents reported seeing him in the area around the time of Tommy's disappearance. Like Webb, Carlson had been released without charges, but the newspaper coverage suggested that his behavior during questioning had raised suspicions among investigators. Rachel found herself taking detailed notes about these potential suspects, cross-referencing their names with other documents in the case file and trying to piece together a more complete picture of the investigation's focus and methodology. Both Webb and Carlson had eventually been eliminated as suspects when alibis were established or other evidence came to light, but their inclusion in the case file provided insight into the thoroughness of Detective Sullivan's approach. As she delved deeper into the investigation records, Rachel began to appreciate the complexity of the challenges that Sullivan and his team had faced. Missing child cases were notoriously difficult to solve, particularly when there were no witnesses to the actual disappearance and no clear motive or suspect. The fact that Tommy had vanished during his regular routine, in broad daylight, in a neighborhood where he was known and welcomed, made the case even more baffling. The search efforts documented in the case file were truly impressive in their scope and organization. Maps showed the systematic grid pattern that searchers had followed through the woods, ensuring that every possible hiding place or burial site was examined. Volunteer schedules revealed that searches had continued for nearly 2 months after Tommy's disappearance, with teams of residents and law enforcement officers combing through increasingly remote areas in the hope of finding some trace of the missing boy. Rachel was particularly struck by the emotional toll the case had taken on everyone involved. Detective Sullivan's later reports showed increasing frustration and exhaustion as promising leads turned into dead ends and potential breakthroughs failed to materialize. The volunteer search coordinators documented similar feelings of helplessness and grief as their efforts failed to bring Tommy home. The final entries in the case file, dated nearly 6 months after Tommy's disappearance, made for particularly sobering reading. By that point, the active search had been suspended, though the case remained officially open. Detective Sullivan's final report acknowledged that without new evidence or witnesses coming forward, there was little more that could be done within the constraints of available resources and investigative techniques. Reading that final report, Rachel felt a deep sadness for everyone who had been touched by Tommy's disappearance. The boy's family, friends, and entire community had experienced a trauma that had never been resolved, a wound that had been allowed to heal over, but had never been properly treated. The fact that the case had faded from public memory seemed like a second tragedy, as if Tommy Brennan was being forgotten twice. It was with these thoughts weighing heavily on her mind that Rachel turned to the final section of the case file, where she would discover the detail that would transform her understanding of everything she had just read. The last section of Tommy Brennan's case file contained what appeared to be miscellaneous documents that hadn't fit neatly into other categories during the original investigation. Rachel found herself looking at a collection of newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes that seemed to represent the more speculative aspects of Detective Sullivan's work, theories and connections that he had explored, but couldn't definitively prove or disprove. Among these materials was a manila envelope marked Media Coverage, Other Cases in Sullivan's distinctive handwriting. Inside, Rachel discovered clippings from newspapers across Ohio and neighboring states, all documenting missing children cases from the late 1980s and early 1990s. Sullivan had apparently been investigating whether Tommy's disappearance might be connected to a larger pattern of child abductions in the region, a line of inquiry that showed remarkable foresight given that serial predator cases were not yet widely understood by local law enforcement. The newspaper clippings were arranged chronologically, starting with cases from 1987 and continuing through 1992. Each clipping had been carefully annotated in Sullivan's handwriting, with notes about the victim's age, circumstances of disappearance, and any similarities to Tommy's case. Rachel could see that the detective had been looking for patterns in methodology, timing, geographic distribution, and victim selection, though his notes suggested he had been unable to establish any definitive connections. As Rachel worked her way through these clippings, she began to appreciate the scope of Sullivan's investigation and his dedication to exploring every possible angle. The cases he had identified shared certain similarities with Tommy's disappearance. Children between the ages of 10 and 14, disappearances that occurred during routine activities in familiar neighborhoods, and investigations that had failed to identify clear suspects or motives. One case that had particularly caught Sullivan's attention was the disappearance of Jennifer Walsh, a 13-year-old girl from Dayton who had vanished while walking to her friend's house in September 1988, just over a year before Tommy's disappearance. Like Tommy, Jennifer had been a responsible child with no history of running away, and she had disappeared during a routine activity in broad daylight. Her case had also involved the discovery of personal belongings in an unexpected location, though in Jennifer's case it had been her backpack found in a drainage culvert several miles from her planned route. Another case that had drawn Sullivan's interest was the disappearance of Michael Torres, an 11-year-old boy from Columbus who had vanished while playing in a park near his home in March 1989. Michael's bicycle had been found abandoned in the park, and witnesses had reported seeing him talking to an adult near the playground equipment, though descriptions of the adult had been too vague to be useful for identification purposes. Reading through Sullivan's notes on these cases, Rachel could see that he had been particularly interested in the geographic distribution of the disappearances. The missing children were from communities within a roughly 200-mile radius of Springfield, suggesting the possibility of a predator who traveled extensively or whose work or lifestyle required regular movement throughout the region. Sullivan had also noted patterns in timing, observing that most of the disappearances had occurred during school months rather than summer vacation, and typically on weekdays rather than weekends. This pattern suggested someone whose schedule or activities were aligned with the school calendar and normal working hours, though Sullivan had been careful to note that the sample size was too small to draw definitive conclusions. What impressed Rachel most about Sullivan's analysis was his awareness of the limitations of his investigation. His notes frequently acknowledged the speculative nature of his theories and the need for more evidence before any conclusions could be drawn. He had clearly been a thoughtful and methodical investigator who understood the difference between interesting patterns and provable connections. It was while reading through Sullivan's notes on the Michael Torres case that Rachel encountered the detail that would change everything. Attached to the newspaper clipping about Michael's disappearance was a photocopy of what appeared to be a police report from the Columbus Police Department. The report documented an interview with a witness who had seen Michael talking to an adult in the park on the day of his disappearance. According to the witness statement, the adult had been a middle-aged man driving a dark-colored van with what appeared to be business lettering on the side panels. The witness, a jogger who had been running through the park, had noticed the interaction because it had seemed somewhat unusual for a child to be talking to a stranger in a vehicle, though not alarming enough to warrant immediate intervention. The witness had told police that the van appeared to be some kind of service or delivery vehicle, though she hadn't been close enough to read the specific business name or contact information. She had described the lettering as being in red or orange paint, and had thought she could make out what might have been a phone number, though she couldn't recall the specific digits. Rachel read through this witness statement twice, feeling a growing sense of excitement as she began to see connections that Sullivan might have missed. The description of a service vehicle with business lettering immediately made her think of the various delivery trucks, repair vans, and maintenance vehicles that would have been common sights in residential neighborhoods during the 1980s and 1990s. What caught her attention specifically was the potential connection to newspaper delivery operations. Many newspapers in the region had used independent contractors to transport bundles of papers from printing facilities to distribution points where individual carriers would pick them up for their routes. These contractors typically drove vans, or small trucks marked with newspaper identification, and their schedules would have aligned perfectly with the timing patterns that Sullivan had observed in the missing children cases. Rachel flipped back through the case file, looking for any references to the newspaper delivery supply chain that would have been operating in Springfield during 1989. She found what she was looking for in a section of business records that documented the Tribune's circulation and distribution operations during that period. According to these records, the Tribune had used a regional distribution company called Midwest Media Services to transport newspaper bundles from their printing facility to various pickup points throughout their circulation area. Midwest Media Services had operated a fleet of vans and trucks that served newspapers across Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, with drivers who traveled regular routes and maintained consistent schedules. The business relationship between the Tribune and Midwest Media Services was documented in contracts and invoices that showed a partnership dating back to 1985. The distribution company had been responsible for delivering newspaper bundles to pickup points in Springfield and surrounding communities, typically arriving between 4 and 5 a.m. to ensure that papers were available for carriers who began their routes at 6 a.m. Rachel found herself studying these business documents with growing interest, particularly the details about driver schedules and route assignments. The drivers employed by Midwest Media Services would have had legitimate reasons to be in residential neighborhoods during early morning hours, and their vehicles would have been familiar sights to children like Tommy who were involved in newspaper delivery operations. More significantly, the drivers would have had detailed knowledge of newspaper routes, carrier schedules, and the daily routines of children involved in paper delivery. They would have known which children worked alone, which routes were most isolated, and what times various carriers could be expected to be in specific locations. As Rachel continued reading through the business documents, she discovered that Midwest Media Services had employed approximately 15 drivers during the period of Tommy's disappearance, with routes that covered a geographic area remarkably similar to the distribution of missing children cases that Sullivan had identified in his research. The more she learned about the company's operations, the more convinced Rachel became that Sullivan had been on the right track with his theory about connected disappearances, but had missed a crucial element that tied the cases together. The newspaper distribution network provided the perfect cover for a predator who wanted to target children involved in delivery routes, offering both legitimate access to residential neighborhoods and detailed knowledge of potential victims, schedules, and routines. Rachel began making notes about Midwest Media Services, jotting down questions she wanted to research further. Who were the drivers employed by the company during the relevant time period? Did any of them have criminal backgrounds or suspicious behavior patterns? Were there records of complaints or concerns about individual drivers' interactions with children or families? She also wanted to investigate whether Midwest Media Services had been connected to newspaper distribution in other communities where children had disappeared. If the same drivers had been delivering papers to Dayton, Columbus, and other cities, where Sullivan had identified similar cases, it would provide strong evidence for the connection theory that the detective had been developing. As Rachel worked through these questions, she realized that she had stumbled upon what might be the key to solving not just Tommy Brennan's disappearance, but potentially several other missing children cases that had haunted communities across the region for decades. The newspaper distribution connection provided both motive and opportunity for a predator who could have operated undetected for years. But Rachel also understood that her theory was still largely speculative, based on patterns and connections that might be coincidental rather than causal. She needed to gather more concrete evidence before she could determine whether her suspicions were justified or whether she was simply seeing patterns where none actually existed. The first step would be to research Midwest Media Services more thoroughly, identifying the specific drivers who had worked for the company during the relevant time period and investigating their backgrounds and employment histories. She also needed to determine whether the company had been operating in other cities where similar disappearances had occurred, and whether there were any records of complaints or concerns about driver behavior. Rachel glanced at her watch and realized that she had been in the basement for nearly 4 hours, completely absorbed in reading through Tommy's case file. Her original assignment about circulation decline seemed trivial in comparison to the potentially groundbreaking investigation that had opened up before her, but she knew that she needed to approach this new story with the same methodical care that had made her successful as an investigative journalist. She carefully photographed the relevant documents from the case file, making sure to capture both Sullivan's original notes and the business records that had led to her theory about Midwest Media Services. She also made detailed notes about the connections she had identified, along with a list of specific questions and research tasks that would need to be completed before she could move forward with the investigation. As Rachel prepared to leave the basement and return to the main newsroom, she felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation about what she had discovered. If her theory was correct, she might be on the verge of solving a decades-old mystery and bringing closure to families who had never learned the fate of their missing children. But she also understood that her investigation could potentially expose uncomfortable truths about law enforcement failures and community oversights that some people might prefer to keep buried. The weight of responsibility settled on Rachel's shoulders as she climbed the stairs from the basement archive room. She was no longer just researching a routine story about newspaper circulation. She was potentially reopening one of Springfield's most traumatic unsolved cases, with implications that could reach far beyond her small hometown. Before she could pursue her investigation further, Rachel needed to decide how to approach her editor about the dramatic shift in her story focus. Jim Kowalski had assigned her to write about circulation decline, not to investigate decades-old missing children cases, and she would need to convince him that her discovery was worth the time and resources that a thorough investigation would require. She also needed to consider the ethical implications of her research. If Midwest Media Services had been connected to multiple child disappearances, there might be families who had never received answers about their missing children, and her investigation could potentially provide the closure they had been seeking for decades. But there were also privacy concerns and the possibility that her research could cause unnecessary pain to people who had spent years trying to move forward from traumatic experiences. As Rachel reached the top of the stairs and prepared to enter the newsroom, she made a mental commitment to pursue her investigation with the same thoroughness and integrity that Detective Sullivan had brought to his work 35 years earlier. Tommy Brennan and the other missing children deserved nothing less than a complete and honest examination of the evidence, regardless of where that examination might lead. Rachel's decision to approach her editor with her discovery proved to be more complicated than she had anticipated. Jim Kowalski's office occupied a corner of the Tribune's second floor, with windows that looked out over Springfield's modest downtown district and walls lined with framed front pages from the newspaper's most significant stories over the past 3 decades. When Rachel knocked on his door that afternoon, carrying a folder filled with photocopied documents from Tommy Brennan's case file, she expected to find him receptive to what could potentially be the biggest investigative story the Tribune had covered in years. Instead, Jim's reaction to her preliminary findings was unexpectedly subdued and strangely evasive. As Rachel explained her theory about Midwest Media Services and the possible connection to multiple missing children cases, she watched Jim's expression grow increasingly uncomfortable. He listened politely, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested he was hearing information he would rather not know. When Rachel finished her presentation, Jim leaned back in his chair and was silent for nearly a full minute, staring out the window at the street below. Finally, he turned back to her with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's an interesting theory, Rachel," he said carefully, "but I'm not sure we have the resources to pursue something this speculative. Missing children cases are incredibly sensitive, and we could do a lot of damage if we start making accusations without solid evidence." Rachel had expected some initial skepticism, but Jim's response seemed disproportionately cautious given the potential significance of her discovery. She pressed him gently, explaining that she wasn't suggesting they make accusations, but simply that they investigate whether there might be connections worth exploring. This could be exactly the kind of story that puts the Tribune back on the map, she argued. If we can solve a 35-year-old mystery, it would be national news. Jim's discomfort became even more apparent at the mention of national attention. He shifted in his chair and began shuffling papers on his desk in a way that suggested he wanted to end the conversation. Look, Rachel, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I think you're getting ahead of yourself. Why don't you focus on finishing the circulation story you were assigned, and we can revisit this other idea later if you still think it has merit? The dismissal felt abrupt and out of character for Jim, who had always encouraged Rachel to pursue interesting leads and had never shown reluctance to take on challenging stories. As she left his office, Rachel found herself puzzling over his reaction and wondering if there was something about the Tommy Brennan case that she didn't understand. Her next stop was the Springfield Police Department, where she hoped to speak with someone who might have institutional memory about the original investigation or access to additional case files that hadn't been included in the Tribune's archive. The police station was housed in a modern brick building that had been constructed in the early 2000s, replacing the older facility where Detective Sullivan would have worked during his investigation of Tommy's disappearance. At the front desk, Rachel introduced herself to Officer Janet Morrison, a middle-aged woman who served as the department's public information coordinator. Rachel explained that she was researching a historical story about missing children cases and was hoping to speak with someone who might remember the Tommy Brennan investigation or have access to additional records. Officer Morrison's reaction was immediate and striking. Her friendly, professional demeanor shifted noticeably when she heard Tommy's name, and she seemed to tense up in a way that suggested the case still carried emotional weight within the department. "The Brennan case," she repeated slowly, as if testing how the words felt in her mouth. "That's going back quite a ways. I'm not sure we have anyone currently on staff who was involved in that investigation." When Rachel asked about accessing case files or speaking with retired officers who might remember the details, Morrison became even more guarded. She explained that old case files were stored in a separate facility and would require special permission to access, particularly for cases involving minors. She also mentioned that the department's policy was to avoid discussing ongoing investigations with media representatives, though when Rachel pointed out that the case was 35 years old, Morrison seemed unable to provide a clear explanation for why those restrictions would still apply. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Morrison offering increasingly elaborate explanations for why Rachel's request would be difficult to accommodate. She mentioned bureaucratic procedures, privacy concerns, and the need to contact various supervisors and legal advisors before any information could be shared. The complexity of her explanations seemed disproportionate to what should have been a straightforward request for information about a decades-old case. Finally, Morrison suggested that Rachel submit a formal written request through the department's legal department, a process that she warned could take several weeks or months to complete. The suggestion felt like a polite but firm dismissal, designed to discourage Rachel from pursuing the matter further rather than to provide genuine assistance with her research. As Rachel left the police station, she reflected on the stark contrast between the two reactions she had received. Jim Kowalski's reluctance to pursue the story could potentially be explained by legitimate concerns about resources and liability, though his behavior had still seemed unusually evasive. Officer Morrison's response, however, had been more difficult to rationalize, particularly her apparent nervousness when discussing a case that should have been a matter of historical record rather than active concern. Rachel decided to try a different approach, reaching out to retired Tribune employees who might remember the original coverage of Tommy's disappearance and could provide insight into why the case had seemingly faded from public memory. Her first call was to Margaret Chen, the newspaper's former city editor who had retired 5 years earlier after a 40-year career at the Tribune. Margaret's reaction to Rachel's inquiry was perhaps the most puzzling of all. When Rachel mentioned that she was researching the Tommy Brennan case, there was a long pause on the phone line before Margaret responded in a voice that sounded strained and uncomfortable. "Why are you asking about that?" she said, her tone sharp in a way that was completely uncharacteristic of the warm, grandmotherly woman Rachel remembered from her early days at the newspaper. Rachel explained her discovery in the archives and her theory about possible connections to other missing children cases, but Margaret's responses became increasingly terse and discouraging. She repeatedly emphasized how long ago the events had occurred, how unreliable old memories could be, and how painful it would be for families to have old wounds reopened without any guarantee of new answers. When Rachel asked whether Margaret remembered any specific details about the Tribune's coverage of the case, the retired editor claimed that her memory of events from that period was too fuzzy to be reliable. This assertion struck Rachel as particularly strange, given that Margaret had always been known for her encyclopedic memory of Tribune stories and her ability to recall specific details from decades past. The conversation ended with Margaret strongly advising Rachel to let sleeping dogs lie and focus on stories that could bring positive attention to Springfield rather than dredging up old tragedies that can't be changed. The phrase felt like a warning rather than advice, and Rachel found herself wondering what Margaret was afraid might be uncovered if the Tommy Brennan case received renewed attention. That evening, Rachel decided to visit her mother again, hoping that Elena's fragmentary memories might provide some insight into the community's reaction to Tommy's disappearance and the subsequent investigation. She found Elena in her kitchen, sorting through stacks of old magazines with the obsessive focus that had become characteristic of her daily routine. When Rachel mentioned Tommy Brennan's name, Elena's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She dropped the magazine she had been holding and turned to face Rachel with an expression of alarm that was startling in its intensity. "Why are you asking about that boy?" Elena demanded, her voice carrying a sharpness that Rachel rarely heard anymore. Rachel gently explained her research, but Elena became increasingly agitated as the conversation continued. She began pacing around the kitchen, wringing her hands and muttering in Spanish, reverting to her native language as she always did when distressed. Finally, she stopped abruptly and faced Rachel directly, her eyes clear and focused in a way they hadn't been in months. "Some stories are buried for good reasons, mija," Elena said, her voice low and serious. "That boy's disappearance brought out things in this town that people didn't want to see. Things about who could be trusted and who couldn't. When the investigation stopped, it wasn't because they ran out of leads. It was because they found leads that pointed in directions nobody wanted to go." Rachel pressed her mother for more specific information, but Elena had already begun to retreat back into the confused state that was becoming her normal condition. She resumed sorting magazines, mumbling vaguely about teachers and students and old secrets that should stay buried. The moment of clarity had passed, leaving Rachel with more questions than answers. The following morning, Rachel attempted to research Midwest Media Services more thoroughly, hoping to find employment records or other documentation that might support her theory about the newspaper distribution connection. She started with online searches, but found surprisingly little information about the company's operations during the relevant time period. Her next step was to contact the Ohio Secretary of State's office, where business and corporation records would be maintained. The clerk she spoke with was helpful and professional, but when she searched for Midwest Media Services, the results were puzzling. According to the official records, the company had been dissolved in 1990, just months after Tommy Brennan's disappearance, with no forwarding address or contact information for the former owners. The timing of the company's dissolution seemed significant, but Rachel needed more information to determine whether it was merely coincidental or part of a larger pattern. She tried searching for former employees or business associates who might remember the company's operations, but her efforts were consistently frustrated by dead ends and missing records. When she attempted to access newspaper industry databases that might contain information about distribution companies from the 1980s and 1990s, she found that many records from that period had been purged or were stored in formats that were no longer easily accessible. The pattern of missing or unavailable Information was beginning to seem less like coincidence and more like deliberate obstruction. Rachel's growing frustration was compounded by the continued resistance she encountered from local sources. When she tried to contact other retired Tribune employees who might remember the Tommy Brennan coverage, she found that many were reluctant to discuss the case or claimed to have no memory of events that should have been among the most significant stories of their careers. Similarly, her attempts to identify and contact former Springfield police officers who had worked during the relevant time period were met with evasive responses or outright refusals to participate in interviews. Even retired officers who had been willing to discuss other aspects of their careers became suddenly unavailable when Tommy Brennan's name was mentioned. The pattern of resistance was becoming too consistent to ignore, and Rachel began to suspect that her investigation had touched on something that certain people were determined to keep hidden. The question was whether the resistance stemmed from a desire to protect innocent people from renewed grief and speculation, or whether there were more troubling reasons why the truth about Tommy's disappearance had been allowed to fade from public memory. As Rachel sat in her apartment that evening, reviewing her notes and trying to make sense of the day's frustrations, she realized that the very resistance she was encountering might actually be evidence that her theory was worth pursuing. If Tommy Brennan's disappearance was simply an unsolved tragedy with no broader implications, there would be no reason for people to be so defensive about discussing it decades later. The fact that multiple sources were actively discouraging her investigation suggested that there might indeed be uncomfortable truths that certain people preferred to keep buried. Rachel understood that she was potentially walking into a situation where powerful interests might be threatened by renewed attention to the case, but she also believed that Tommy Brennan and his family deserved to have the truth uncovered, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might prove to be for others. Determined not to let the pattern of resistance derail her investigation, Rachel decided to expand her research beyond Springfield and pursue leads that might be less susceptible to local pressure or influence. Her first priority was to verify whether Midwest Media Services had indeed operated in other cities where missing children cases had occurred during the same time period that Detective Sullivan had identified in his research. Rachel began by contacting newspapers in Dayton, Columbus, and other Ohio cities where similar disappearances had taken place, hoping to find business records or former employees who might remember the distribution company's operations. Her approach was methodical and patient, understanding that she would need to build trust with sources who might be naturally reluctant to discuss sensitive topics with an unknown journalist from another city. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching the Jennifer Walsh disappearance in Dayton, Rachel connected with Tom Bradley, a retired circulation manager who had worked for the Dayton Daily News during the late 1980s. Unlike the evasive responses she had received in Springfield, Bradley was forthcoming about his memories of the period and eager to help with her research. Bradley confirmed that Midwest Media Services had indeed been one of several distribution companies that the Daily News had contracted with during that period. He remembered the company primarily because of problems they had experienced with reliability and customer service, issues that had eventually led to the termination of their business relationship in early 1990. More significantly, Bradley recalled that there had been complaints from newspaper carriers and their families about inappropriate behavior by some Midwest Media Services drivers. While he couldn't remember specific details, he distinctly recalled meetings with parents who were concerned about drivers who seemed overly interested in their children's routines and personal information. There was one driver in particular, Bradley told Rachel during their phone conversation, who made several families uncomfortable. Parents complained that he would ask their kids personal questions about their schedules, their families, where they went to school. At first, we thought he was just being friendly, but the complaints kept coming in. Bradley explained that the Daily News had reported these concerns to Midwest Media Services management, but the company's response had been defensive and dismissive. Rather than investigating the complaints or addressing the behavioral issues, Company representatives had accused the newspaper of trying to interfere with their employee relationships and had threatened to terminate their contract if the complaints continued. The contract had indeed been terminated, but according to Bradley, it was the Daily News that had initiated the cancellation after receiving additional complaints about driver behavior and growing concerns about the company's unwillingness to address legitimate safety issues. The termination had occurred in March 1990, just 5 months after Jennifer Walsh's disappearance and 6 months after Tommy Brennan had vanished in Springfield. Rachel asked Bradley if he could remember the name of the problematic driver, but 34 years had dimmed his memory of specific details. He did recall that the man had been middle-aged, probably in his 40s, and had driven a dark blue van with red lettering that identified him as a Midwest Media Services employee. The description matched the witness account from the Michael Torres case in Columbus that Rachel had found in Detective Sullivan's files. Encouraged by this confirmation of her theory, Rachel expanded her research to include other newspapers that might have contracted with Midwest Media Services during the relevant time period. She discovered that the company had operated throughout Ohio, Pennsylvania, and parts of Indiana and West Virginia, serving dozens of newspapers across a geographic area that aligned remarkably well with the distribution of missing children cases that Sullivan had identified. Her next significant breakthrough came when she located Ruth Henderson, a former bookkeeper for Midwest Media Services who had worked for the company from 1987 until its dissolution in 1990. Henderson, now retired and living in Florida, was initially reluctant to discuss her former employer, but became more cooperative when Rachel explained the potential connection to missing children cases. Henderson confirmed that Midwest Media Services had been dissolved abruptly in 1990 amid what she described as legal troubles and financial problems. She had been given only 2 weeks' notice of the company's closure and had never received a full explanation of the circumstances that led to its demise. More importantly, Henderson was able to provide Rachel with information about the company's employment practices and driver roster during the relevant time period. According to her records, Midwest Media Services had employed 17 drivers at its peak, with routes that covered territories throughout the region. The company had been notable for its lax hiring practices, often employing drivers without conducting thorough background checks or verifying employment references. Henderson remembered that several drivers had been fired or had quit suddenly during her tenure with the company, though she hadn't been privy to the specific reasons for their departures. She did recall that there had been complaints from newspaper clients about driver behavior, and that these complaints had become more frequent during 1989 and early 1990. When Rachel asked about specific drivers who might have been involved in the complaints, Henderson was able to provide her with several names from memory. One name that stood out was Robert Kemp, a driver who had been employed by the company from 1988 until early 1990, and whose route had included territories in both Springfield and Columbus. According to Henderson's recollection, Kemp had been fired from Midwest Media Services in February 1990 after what she described as serious complaints from multiple clients. She didn't know the specific nature of these complaints, but she remembered that the termination had been immediate and that Kemp had been escorted from the premises by company security. Rachel felt a surge of excitement as she realized that she might have identified a specific suspect who had both access to potential victims and a pattern of problematic behavior that had resulted in his dismissal from Midwest Media Services. Robert Kemp's employment period coincided perfectly with the time frame of the missing children cases, and his route assignments placed him in the right locations at the right times. Her next challenge was to locate current information about Robert Kemp and determine whether he might still be alive and accessible for investigation. Using online databases and public record searches, Rachel was able to trace Kemp's movements after his departure from Midwest Media Services, though the trail was complicated by several address changes and what appeared to be deliberate efforts to maintain a low profile. According to public records, Kemp had moved to Pennsylvania shortly after leaving Midwest Media Services, where he had worked briefly for another transportation company before disappearing from official records for several years. He had resurfaced in West Virginia in the mid-1990s, where he had been arrested for assault and served 6 months in county jail. After his release, he had moved again, this time to Kentucky, where he had lived under various addresses until the early 2000s. The most recent records Rachel could find for Robert Kemp showed him living in a mobile home park outside Lexington, Kentucky, where he had been cited several times for municipal violations and had been involved in a dispute with neighbors that had required police intervention. The records were recent enough to suggest that he might still be living in the area, though Rachel understood that tracking down someone with Kemp's pattern of frequent moves would require careful planning and potentially dangerous fieldwork. Before attempting to locate Kemp directly, Rachel decided to investigate his background more thoroughly, hoping to find additional evidence that might support her theory about his involvement in the missing children cases. Her research revealed a troubling pattern of behavior that extended back decades before his employment with Midwest Media Services. Court records showed that Kemp had been arrested multiple times during the 1970s and early 1980s for offenses including trespassing, stalking, and what were then classified as disturbance of the peace charges that appeared to involve inappropriate interactions with minors. While he had never been convicted of serious crimes against children, the pattern of his arrests suggested someone with persistent boundary issues and an unhealthy interest in young people. Rachel also discovered that Kemp had been employed by several other companies during the 1980s that would have provided him with access to residential neighborhoods and opportunities to observe children's routines. He had worked as a meter reader, a delivery driver for various companies, and briefly as a substitute school bus driver, though his employment in each position had been terminated under circumstances that weren't clearly documented in available records. The employment pattern painted a picture of someone who consistently sought jobs that would provide access to children while avoiding positions that required extensive background checks or ongoing supervision. The choice to work for Midwest Media Services, with its lax hiring practices and unsupervised driving routes, seemed to fit perfectly with this pattern of behavior. As Rachel compiled her research on Robert Kemp, she began to see how he could have been responsible for multiple child abductions across the region. His work schedule would have made him familiar with newspaper delivery routes and carrier schedules, giving him detailed knowledge of when and where children would be most vulnerable. His legitimate presence in residential neighborhoods would have provided perfect cover for surveillance and approach opportunities, while his access to a company vehicle would have facilitated transportation of victims. The timeline of his employment with Midwest Media Services aligned perfectly with the peak period of missing children cases that Detective Sullivan had identified. His firing in February 1990 coincided with the end of reported disappearances in the region, suggesting that his removal from the position might have disrupted his ability to identify and access potential victims. Rachel realized that she had potentially identified not just Tommy Brennan's abductor, but a serial predator who had operated across multiple states for several years before being inadvertently stopped by his termination from Midwest Media Services. The implications were staggering, suggesting that dozens of families might finally be able to learn the truth about their missing children. However, Rachel also understood that her theory, while compelling, was still largely circumstantial. She had established opportunity and a pattern of suspicious behavior, but she lacked the physical evidence or eyewitness testimony that would be necessary to prove Kemp's guilt definitively. Moreover, the passage of 35 years had likely compromised or destroyed much of the evidence that might have been available to investigators at the time of the original crimes. Despite these limitations, Rachel believed that her research had uncovered enough evidence to warrant reopening the investigation into Tommy Brennan's disappearance and potentially other missing children cases from the same period. The question was how to proceed, given the resistance she had encountered from local authorities and the complex jurisdictional issues involved in cases that spanned multiple states. Rachel decided that her best approach would be to present her findings to federal law enforcement agencies that would have the resources and authority to investigate potential serial crimes across state lines. She began preparing a comprehensive report that documented her research and outlined the connections she had identified between Robert Kemp, Midwest Media Services, and the pattern of missing children cases. As she worked on compiling her evidence, Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her from a routine assignment about newspaper circulation to potentially solving one of the region's most persistent mysteries. The resistance she had encountered from local sources now made perfect sense in the context of what she had discovered. If her theory was correct, the truth about Tommy Brennan's disappearance would reveal not just the identity of a serial predator, but also massive failures by law enforcement agencies that had failed to recognize the connections between cases or to properly investigate a suspect who had been hiding in plain sight. The story that had begun with a misfiled folder in a newspaper archive was about to become one of the most significant investigative pieces of Rachel's career, with the potential to bring closure to dozens of families and expose systemic problems in how missing children cases had been handled during a crucial period in American law enforcement history. If you found this incredible investigation as compelling as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice finally being served and mysteries that took decades to solve.